journey to trace the Myers family from the time that they left Germany until they arrived in Philadelphia and thence into central Pennsylvania. I'd like to make the point that this little video presentation is not intended to be all-inclusive. It is not complete. As a matter of fact, there are probably more questions that we had unanswered than questions that we were able to answer. But I think this represents a very fascinating challenge to all of us in the Myers clan for this generation and future generations. I would hope that the present generation and future generations would go into a more detailed search of the genealogical family tree of the Myers family. And perhaps in time, in future family reunions, we can bring all this information together and share it and complete the whole history of the family tree, remembering that the next family reunion will be in Albuquerque in 1992. Now, having said all of that, let me just acknowledge the help that 3 or 4 people provided in pulling this little video together. Remembering this is not a professional video tape, but rather strictly an amateur attempt. I want to first thank my wife, Laretha Faye Myers, who, when we were in Huntington, Pennsylvania, where the Church of the Brethren College, Juniata College, is located, Laretha was really the first one to come across the name officially of Hans Ewald Myers, then spelled M-E-Y-E-R, who was our forebearer that we can trace back that first came to America. She found his name actually in the shipping list when he arrived in Philadelphia in November of 1741. Then to my sister, Virginia Myers Hinahan of Ohio, who joined us on this trip. Virginia did some excellent research also in the library there, the research library. She came across some very interesting information about our father, Howard Samuel Myers Sr., who attended and graduated from Juniata College in 1910. We found out that he was quite a basketball star, and also that he gave a piano recital at one of their events there. We were unaware of that. Then to her husband, Dr. Jim Hinahan, Jim sort of validated all of the information that we were able to come up with and did a fine job there. To their son, Jim Hinahan Jr., well, when I wasn't photographing with a video camera, Jim was photographing with the camera, so he did a very fine job on that. Finally, to my nephew, Bill Myers Jr. of Virginia Beach. Bill is a high school teacher in Virginia Beach, and what he teaches, interestingly enough, is television communications. So technically, he helped me put all this together. Well, my hope is, of course, that you will enjoy this little presentation and that you will find it both informative and challenging for the future. So, now, on with the show. The Myers, who are these folks? Our earliest known forefather was Hans Ewald Myers, who was born in the Palatine province of Germany, probably in or around the village of Zweibrücken. He and his family left this area around 1740 or 1741 for their new home in America. He probably took the conventional route to Rotterdam via the Rhine River, as hundreds, if not thousands, had done before him. We know that Hans was born in 1681 and was 60 years old when he arrived in America. It's reasonable to assume that his wife, Anna Maria, and his two sons, Peter and Nicholas, accompanied him on this trip to America. We have yet to trace their exact burial spot, but we'll leave that for the future. The journey to Pennsylvania fell naturally into three parts. The first part, and by no means the easiest, was the journey down the Rhine to Rotterdam or some other port in Holland. This journey lasted from the beginning of May to the end of October, fully half a year, amid much hardship. The trip down the Rhine lasted, therefore, 4, 5, or even 6 weeks. When the ships come into Holland, they are detained there likewise 5 or 6 weeks because things are very costly and the poor people have to spend nearly all that they have during this time. The second stage of the journey was from Rotterdam to one of the English ports. Most of the ships called at the Isle of Wight. This was a favorite stopping place in England, as 142 ships are recorded as having sailed from Rotterdam to the Isle of Wight. Now, we are not certain exactly where the Europa stopped in England after she departed Rotterdam, but we feel that it was probably at the Isle of Wight. In England, there was another delay of 1 or 2, sometimes 3 weeks when the ships were waiting either to be passed through the custom house or waiting for favorable winds. The real misery began with the long voyage to America. For from their ships, unless they had good winds, they must often sail 8, 9, 10, or 12 weeks before reaching Philadelphia. But even with the best of winds, the average voyage took about 7 weeks. The final stage of the journey, or the ocean voyage proper, was marked by much suffering and hardship. The passengers being packed in like sardines, often without proper food or water, were soon subject to all sorts of disease such as dysentery, scurry, typhoid, and smallpox. Children aboard were the first to be attacked by these diseases and died in large numbers. There's one recording where 45 children died aboard one ship. The misery reached the climax when a gale raged for 2 or 3 nights and days, so that everyone aboard believed that the ship certainly was going to the bottom. When at last the Delaware River was reached and the city of brotherly love came into sight where all their miseries were to end, another delay occurred. A health official had to visit the ship, and if any person with infectious disease were discovered aboard the ship was ordered to remove 1 mile from the city. From Philadelphia, we know that Hans Myers migrated westward into central Pennsylvania. In 1756, he and his family were living in Mannaheim Township, which is in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Today, this region has one of the largest group of Amish believers in America. Because the township boundaries have shifted over the years, the exact location where Hans and his family settled is not clear at this point. We do have records, however, that one of Hans' sons, Nicholas, and his wife, Hannah Ecklenburg Myers, had 4 sons, Martin, Stephen, Jacob, and Samuel. We Myers today can take our lineage through this Samuel, the son of Nicholas, on down through our great-great-grandparents, our great-grandparents, our grandparents, and our own parents. It's a fascinating story of how these early Myers pressed westward through much hardship to seek out their new homes in America, finally settling in what today is known as Ferguson Valley, near McBaytown, Pennsylvania. Not all of them finally settled in Pennsylvania, however. Some continued the journey to California, such as Peter and David Myers, where they started a Brethren Church colony in and around Los Angeles. Others went to Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, and beyond. At this point, a little historic background might be of interest. Pennsylvania German immigration and its part in the settlement and development of America form an epic tale of faith and zeal, of sacrifice and achievement. The story has been told many times, and Pennsylvania German pioneers have come into their rightful place as builders of our nation. This certainly includes the early members of the Myers family who arrived in this country in the early to mid-18th century. The land known as Pennsylvania was granted by King Charles II of England to William Penn in 1681 in liquidation of a debt of 16,000 pounds, which the British Crown owed to Penn's father. It was the largest tract ever granted in America to a single individual. Under this charter, Penn was also governor of the province, which he and his sons held, with the exception of about 2 years under William III, until the Revolution of 1776. Thus, in a strict sense, Pennsylvania was not the colony of any foreign power, but as a British subject, Penn owed allegiance to the Crown, and while the government of Pennsylvania was proprietary in form, it was English in substance, and non-British subjects were known as foreigners. In order to secure settlers for the land, Penn personally visited the Rhine provinces on many occasions, and through his agents, he disseminated the news of his acquisition and invited the Rhinelanders, the suffering Palatines, and this is the area from which the Myers immigrated, to help him found a state in which religious and civil liberties would prevail. Beginning with the Germantown settlement, right outside of Philadelphia in 1683. Up to the Revolution and the dawn of the 19th century, a large-scale immigration followed, which spread through Pennsylvania. When the pioneers arrived, the government of Pennsylvania was in the hands of the British subjects. Penn's agents were Englishmen. The English language was used, not German, and English common law was enforced. Therefore, in 1727, the council passed a law requiring that all continentals, so-called, who arrived in Philadelphia to take oath of allegiance to the British Crown. 2 years later, the continental immigrants were required also to take an oath of abjuration and fidelity to uphold the laws of the province. The oaths were administered and subscribed to before public officials. Seen here is the document attesting that Hans Ewald Myers did in fact take such an oath on November the 20th, 1741, along with some very interesting company, 3 Eisenhowers who were aboard the ship. Europa with Hans are shown on the right-hand column next to his name. These ancestors of ours were more than mere immigrants in the everyday sense of the word. They were even more than refugees from a beloved and despoiled homeland. They were pioneers in that they came not to a ready-made republic of opportunity, but to a virgin land inhabited by savages. They blazed the trail that helped to transform that land into America of today, and to build our institutions and to mold the American character and values we cherish. Many were men of eminence in their fatherland. Others came to us as virtual slaves of the redemptionist system. Together they worked in one. Together they fought America's battles and led in public service, industry, science, education, invention, and in the art of agriculture, which is the very foundation of our national wealth and of human progress. We now shift to the present era and visit in and around McVeytown, Pennsylvania, where Samuel and Elizabeth Myers lived for many years. Recalling that there were many Samuels in our lineage, this particular Samuel is the Samuel who was the son of Samuel, who was the son of Nicholas, who was the son of Hans Ewald Myers. First, however, let's visit Juniata College at Huntington, which is just a few miles from McVeytown. This is the Church of the Brethren College in which many Myers not only attended, but were strong supporters and on occasion members of the faculty over the years. When 5 of us visited Juniata College in June of 1989, we found an excellent resource library at our disposal with many old church and historic records of value in our search for details of the Myers family.
Attainment and development. Our members have returned from a short vacation, fired with a determination to uphold and advance the high standards of our society. We have added to our number several new members, and we wish them success in becoming useful and efficient workers. The following public program was rendered before a full house on the evening of January the 7th. Piano solo, Howard Myers. I can't imagine.
I didn't even know he played it.
Something about that when you picture home motel ritual or
You
something.
know, Daddy could always pick out things on the piano, but I never realized he played. I mean, when we'd go someplace that had a piano, he'd kind of mess with it, and Mother would too. What was it? She always played something different. But I think that's neat.
That is. The Palatines, imported in the ship Europa, qualified in November 20th, 1741.
Now, we're talking about who?
That's Hans Ewald.
Hans Ewald, okay.
And they found on November 17th, 1741, they were examined by the doctor and found that there were no, the captain was from Rotterdam, and found that there were no diseases on the board that is, on board that is infectious.
Mm-hmm.
And then over here, November the 20th, 1741, was the day that they took their oaths to the government.
Their oath to the government.
Oath
So
to
how
the
many days was
government.
that after they
The
arrived?
17th was when they were found to be no infectious diseases.
Now, they arrived
They
in
arrived on the
Philadelphia.
20th, and on that same day, they took their oath.
So what this is, this is
46,
the
something like that.
this is the first tracing of Hans Ewald Myers that we've officially received, and it comes out of an authentic book. And
What is that book?
yeah, they
Pennsylvania German Pioneers of Strasburger. It's
Right.
published by the Pennsylvania German Society.
Yeah.
And these are official copies of official records in Philadelphia.
Right.
From Juniata College, we next traveled along the banks of the Juniata River a short distance to Shirleysburg, where we wanted to explore the German Valley Church Cemetery, as it had been told to us that many Myers lay there. The German Valley Church of the Brethren, often called the Old Stone Church, is tucked away in another Pennsylvania valley of great beauty. We explored and indeed found the headstones of many Myers, but not the first Samuel Myers, the son of Nicholas, for whom we were searching. Many of the Myers who lay here are members of our family through later marriages and will represent a very interesting study for the future. From Germany Valley, we again skirted the Juniata River to McVeytown, in which so many of our family members are associated. McVeytown is a quaint little village with a town square and a monument dedicated to Dr. Rothrock, the father of forestry in Pennsylvania. The name Rothrock is also affiliated with our family, however, this requires further study. While in McVeytown, we visited the old home site of Reuben Myers, which was a short distance from the center of town. Reuben was one of the many preachers of the family and the father of 13 children by 2 wives, Elizabeth and Fianna. But more about Reuben later. We next traveled a short distance to one of our primary destinations, the original home site of Samuel and Elizabeth Schellenberger Myers, located in a beautiful valley called the Ferguson Valley. It's a 14-mile-long valley whose beauty is very hard to describe. This is a home site in which Samuel and Elizabeth bore 10 children, from which we are all descendants. It's a peaceful, beautiful setting, lying within the site of the Spring Run Church, just up the valley a bit, the Church of the Brethren, in which the entire family attended and supported and produced a lot of preachers over the years. Today it is occupied by a Mennonite family, that is the Myers old home site, by the name of Yoda, who run a very prosperous dairy farm. Mrs. Yoda was very kind enough to invite us in, and was, with very gracious hospitality, showed us the room in which church services were held before the Spring Run Church was built. The room was divided, as was the custom then, into 2 sections, one for the ladies with their laced head caps and the other for the men, most of whom had long beards. The following article from the McVeigh Journal, dated Thursday, June the 5th, 1873, should give us all pause for reflection on the life and character of Samuel Myers and his beloved wife, Elizabeth Schellenberger Myers. It reads as follows. On Friday, the 23rd of May, Mr. Samuel Myers had what he styled a family gathering, or what is now a day called a golden wedding, he having been married to his present wife 50 years in March last. This family gathering consisted of a reunion of all their children, 6 sons and 4 daughters, with their wives and their husbands, residing respectively in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, together with 4 of his neighbors and friends and their wives. The meeting was eminently of a devotional character, consisting of a religious exercise of the most fervent thankfulness to Almighty God for the remarkable providence he had manifested in thus sparing the life of every member of the family up to the present time. The venerable patriarch, with his beloved companion, seated themselves at the head of the family group. Next were his 2 oldest daughters with their husbands. Next, the oldest son with his wife, and so on in a regular succession according to seniority down to the youngest son and his wife. The circle was then complete by the invited guest. The services were opened by Reverend Joseph Hanwalt, who made a very appropriate introductory address. A hymn was then sung and a prayer offered. The venerable patriarch read from the 2nd and 3rd chapters of Ecclesiastes, followed by an address to his children of the most pathetic and touching character. Among other things, he referred to his settlement on the farm on which he now resides in 1820. In 1822, he was married and continued to live on the same farm to the present time, where they expect to spend the remainder of their lives, having never moved except from the old house into the one they built and now occupy. He particularly thanked God that none of his sons or son-in-laws were a drunkard, and with scarce exception, none was addicted to the use of tobacco. The ceremony thus being closed, the company were seated around a table covered with the choice productions of the season, of which all partook with satisfaction and delight. This remarkable family have scarce a parallel in this country. Mr. and Mrs. Myers have been married up to 50 years. They had 10 children, every one of whom is now living. They are all married. During the married life of Mr. and Mrs. Myers, they never had a death in their house. 2 of their sons and 2 of their son-in-laws are ministers of the gospel, all of the same church, the Church of the Brethren. They have 58 grandchildren. We next traveled up the road, just a short piece, to the Spring Run Church of the Brethren. It derived its name from the little spring which runs alongside the church. This is where the early baptisms took place. At this point, a little background on the phrase dunkers might be in order. It was in 1708 that Alexander Max, a miller and preacher living near Schwarzenau in Germany, became convinced that the beliefs and practices of the established church upon the subject of baptism was all wrong. 8 other men and women were of his own way of thinking. He baptized them all in the river Eder, having concluded from his study of the scriptures that baptism by immersion was the only right way. From that practice, they were nicknamed the Tunkers, from the German word Eintunker, meaning to dip. They themselves preferred to be called Brethren. Well, part of this little band came to Pennsylvania in 1719, led by their preacher, Peter Becker, and 10 years later, the rest followed. They were by this time in America called Dunkers. There are living members of the Myers family today who well remember the phrase Dunkers, as that is what the early Myers were called. This sect gradually changed its name and is today called the Church of the Brethren. In the Spring Run Church of the Brethren, there were 6 members of the Myers family who were elected ministers over the years. They were Abram Myers, Reuben Myers, J. Allen Myers, Samuel Myers Jr., Peter Myers, and George S. Myers. Of this group, 3 were presiding bishops at one time or another: Peter Myers, Abram Myers, and Reuben Myers. There are individuals in the Spring Run Church today and members of the family who remember the preaching of Reuben Myers, who was considered a true servant of God and a lifetime member of the Spring Run Church. He was called to the deacon's office in 1867, to the ministry on October the 20th, 1867, through the laying on of hands of George S. Myers and Walter Long. He represented his congregation at district meetings 8 times and twice at General Conference. He was active in the Sunday school when it first began and served as a superintendent a number of times. Reuben was an able preacher who served his flock faithfully until his death in 1928. He is buried in the Spring Run Cemetery directly behind the church alongside his parents, Samuel and Elizabeth, his first wife, Elizabeth, and his second wife, Fianna, and numerous Myers relatives. Another fascinating episode in tracing the whereabouts of the various Myers who scattered hither and yon over the years is the story of Peter Myers, who was designated by his church in Pennsylvania to go west to spread the gospel and to start a Brethren colony. They couldn't have gone much further west, as they ended up in California, where they organized the first Brethren church in Las Covina, later changed to Covina, which is about 25 miles east of Los Angeles. This occurred in the year 1884, after a long and arduous journey from Pennsylvania. After Peter and his group settled in Las Covina, a number of brethren followed from Pennsylvania with their families and settled there. Peter and his brother David, who followed him into California, are both buried in the Evergreen Cemetery in Los Angeles. The last part of our journey takes us to Myerstown, Pennsylvania. It has been suggested over the years that perhaps some members of our family had settled here, and the name Myerstown might have resulted from such a settlement. No evidence at this time could be found to suggest such a connection. The town is quaint and not far from the heart of the Amish country in Lancaster. Myerstown was laid down by one Isaac Meyer, spelled M-E-I-E-R, in 1768. The house you see was occupied by Isaac Meyer and his family. They lived a life of elegance in those times until he was shot in the back and died in 1770. We shall leave the question of Myerstown and his relationship to our family for further research. So this ends our journey in the exploration for facts on the Myers family. In later years, there will no doubt be more uncovered by succeeding generations as we continue to grow more branches on the Myers family tree. In closing, let's remember the legacy left to us by our brethren ancestors, their faith in God, their struggles, their strengths, and their contributions to our society and to the Myers family name. Each of us can truly say, as the psalmist said, "Yea, I have a goodly heritage." Here are some of these fine people who, by birth or marriage, can claim association with the Hans Ewald Myers family. The young, the not so young, the old, the not so old, those who have passed on and those whom the torch has been passed from the banks of the Rhine River in Germany to the Juniata River in Pennsylvania and beyond.